Hey everyone, it's 6:28 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, August 14th in the year that we're told, 2023. And I'm making this video today just as it's a response to some of the points brought up by Jim Rizoli and Diane King regarding biblical food laws and just regarding some points in the Bible in general, because it's just easier to make a sort of a response video like this rather than try to explain some of these things in the comments. This was their walk and talk that they do, recorded on August 11th of this year, so just a few days ago. And Jim said in the video, hey, if anyone has any input on these issues, to let me know, to give me some kind of response or whatever. So I put a couple comments in there, but they weren't addressed except by one person who doesn't seem to understand the issues at hand. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to play some parts of this and then just go over some of the issues that I have, or, just respond to the material in general, okay? So we'll start here with kind of the kickoff question. And now, just before that, note that Jim did say that there are some people who seem to interpret the Bible, that the Bible says that we shouldn't eat meat, or that we should only eat certain kinds of meat, and so on and so forth. And Diane commented, you can watch the whole video. It says it's on his BitChute wall, that they misuse the Bible, which I would agree that these people, all of them out there that are teaching on these subjects, misuse the Bible. And I would like to encourage Jim and Diane to stay consistent with that, in the sense that they don't even accidentally misuse the Bible based on bad information or incomplete information. What information do we have about the Bible? What can we absolutely know is true about the Bible? What can we not know is true about the Bible? And when I say the Bible, I am actually referring to what they're referring to, which is 66 books, individual books, all collected together by people we don't know. Basically, faceless people got together and decided at different times that those 66 books constituted one singular work that most people have come to know as the Bible, or the Holy Bible. Of course, it's gone through changes, and there have been versions of the Bible, like the Catholic and even Protestant Bibles, that included the Apocrypha. And I would think that a lot of people, unfortunately not all people, would agree that those apocryphal books, they don't belong in the Bible. They are way too problematic, even on their surface, to belong in the Bible. But unfortunately, it's like the Machtemes books, they're still pretty much regarded as history, or close to history, Jewish history. But we'll get into that. So we'll just dive into the points in this video. So this is going to be the first few minutes, and a good deal of the body of what they're talking about. I'll go ahead and play that.
So the question is, if you guys are Bible people, or whether you're Bible people or not, maybe you might be interested in anyway, should we eat meat or should we not eat meat? Is God against us eating meat? Does the Bible say we shouldn't eat meat? Those are the questions. Diane's going to start off.
Well, again, good morning. And my concern, you can do whatever you want, is the mandate. There are people that attempt to mandate what we're supposed to do. Now, we can discuss throughout the Old Testament after the fall, that people, I guess they possibly were eating vegetables at that point. They didn't have the need to kill cows, and their bodies were able to accommodate a vegetarian diet. After the fall, they weren't, and they would be growing cattle, goats, sheep, and that permeated throughout the first 4,000 years, well up to the present day. There were certain rules and guidelines for eating meat. One was not to consume the blood with the meat, and if you were not supposed to eat meat, there wouldn't be instructions on dealing with the blood. There were sacrifices. The priests ate it. I mean, we could just name one right after the other. David was a shepherd of sheep. They not only used the sheep for wool, but also to consume the meat as well. So it's absurd to think that Bible teaches not to eat meat. And the final New Testament, there are a number of laws and rules dealing with how to butcher animals in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it became, the Apostle Paul very clearly states twice in Colossians and Romans that it's not supposed to be used as a point of contention. In Colossians 2:16, he says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect to a holy day or the new moon or the Sabbath days." In Romans 14, 5 and 6, "One man esteemeth one day above the other, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord. He that regardeth not the day to the Lord doth he not regard it. He that eateth, he eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks. And he that eateth not to the Lord, he eateth not and giveth God thanks." And there's more in each of these chapters about these topics, about not making it a point of contention, a big deal. If you want to do it, you do so. I will try, when I'm around you and I feel it's okay, but you don't, I'll try not to offend you. That's the point. Not making it a battleground is the point. Okay.
Okay, so I could spend a number of lengthy videos just trying to address those few minutes of information that we all just heard. And in fact, lots of people do. Christianity, no matter what flavor it is, I don't care if it's Jehovah's Witness, Catholic, I don't care if it's Christian identity or what it is, they have spent the length of my life and my parents' lives arguing these topics. You can get books that argue the minutia of these topics, and apparently they haven't come to any solid resolution. And that's why, for instance, within the realm of Christianity, there are so many denominations, and a lot of them have extremely strong arguments for why they're not agreeing with this other sect or denomination, and so on and so forth. And this is the problem. This is why it's not a good thing to spend countless hours arguing on the topics just raised here or a lot of others, because the fundamental issues with these topics, or with what the Bible says about these topics, needs to be addressed in our epistemology. That is really, at its core, the fundamental problem, is our epistemology, and it is our lack of discernment between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Again, we're talking about two conglomerations of books, catalogs of books, that were put all together, and that we were told by strangers at various times that they all belong together. That's part of our epistemological problem. The other part of our epistemological problem has to do with language, not just of the Greek. There's actually far less problems with the Koine Greek in the New Testament than there is with the Masoretic Hebrew of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is not comprised just of Hebrew. The Old Testament, in its Hebrew form, is comprised of 2 languages. And I spent far over an hour in my film, documentary, whatever you want to call it, bringing it all together, discussing the problems with using, for instance, the Septuagint, which is also in Koine Greek, as a guide. There's a lot of people who believe that the Septuagint is far more accurate as an Old Testament document than the Hebrew. I spent a great amount of time illustrating how the Septuagint is actually comprised of language and terminology that follows the Masoretic Hebrew. And the Masorah is in and of itself an entire issue that we have with understanding the Old Testament. The New Testament, not so bad. Again, people argue on the minutia of the New Testament, but there is, I would say there's not nearly as much of a problem with how the Koine Greek has been brought into English as there is a problem of the themes in the New Testament and how much they agree or disagree with the themes of the Old Testament. That's our problem. The thing is, I spent years arguing the peripherals, arguing the secondary and the tertiary, thinking about and studying the secondary, the tertiary, and even further out than that, when what I should have done was get to the epistemology. And when I started a serious study of the New Testament, what I found out was I'm not going to be able to understand this if I don't understand the Old Testament. Everything in the New Testament, its entire claim of authenticity from Matthew to Revelation, hinges on it being authentic and harmonious with the Old Testament, which I argue it is not. And in fact, the insistence of Christians that the New Testament is in harmony with the Old Testament is the bread and butter of Christian critics, or critics of Christianity, the likes of Charles Giuliani, Matt Dillahunty, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Bart Ehrman. I could keep going. And these people make a great case against the Bible. They make a great case against the Bible because they don't approach just the Old Testament and its themes and what are the problems or not, and just the New Testament and its themes and the problems or not. They use the Old and the New Testament together, and they make quite an excellent argument. In fact, out of all the debates that I've heard against Christian scholars with atheist scholars, I would say in general that if it weren't for my programming, the way I was brought up from the time of being a little kid, brought up with believing that the New Testament and the Old Testament were in agreement, that the New Testament was actually Scripture in the same way that the Old Testament was, and that the New Testament was, in fact, authenticated, God-breathed, in the same manner as we would regard the Old Testament. It is the fact that I was taught that from the earliest age that caused me to not listen to debates, say Bible critics against theologians and Bible scholars, with an objective ear. Because once I started listening to those debates with an objective ear, and once I started reading Bible critics with an objective ear, I realized very quickly they had an extremely strong case. And the only people that come away from debates like that who believe that the Christian side won are people who are so programmed and so skewed to hanging on to the full testimony of the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, that they refuse to see that 9 times out of 10, and probably more than that the atheist or Bible critic side made a far better argument. Now, unless we're talking about some arguments where you have an extremely, extremely well-educated and competent figure on the Christian side, and you have an extremely incompetent figure on the opposite side. If you have the two very equally matched as far as their education and abilities, typically the atheists make far better arguments, or the Bible critics. I suppose they don't have to be atheists, they could be theists, but they may believe in some other God or something, quite different. What's his name? The professor from Oxford, now his name doesn't come to mind, who actually believes that we could have been seeded from an alien race. So and he would have to consider those people godlike or quasi, definitely higher than us. So they don't have to necessarily be atheists, okay? So there's our problem, epistemology. So what is epistemology? So just from Dictionary by Farlex in the encyclopedia section, it says it's the branch of philosophy that is directed towards theories of the sources, nature, and limits of knowledge. Since the 17th century, epistemology has been one of the fundamental themes of philosophers who were necessarily obliged to coordinate the theory of knowledge with developing scientific thought. Then they go on to talk more about it. If you go just to the simple dictionary definition, the branch of philosophy that examines the nature of knowledge, its presuppositions and foundations, and its extent and validity. Okay. And that applies to anything. All knowledge. It applies to Bible, knowledge of the Bible, and whether or not the Bible is true or not is not different than if we're looking at our historical epistemology. It's not different than if we're looking at our scientific epistemology. It's the same. We have to use the same rules, techniques, mindset, and we have to have an open mind as far as to the truth and facts, and does something have a lot of weight to it, an argument or a lot of evidence to it. It's same thing applies if we're talking about historical revisionism. The same rules have to apply. Where are we getting our information from? Where does our knowledge come from? If we apply that to historical revisionism, of course, the majority of the world, their knowledge has come from dubious sources. Professional Hollywood film directors making death camp films. And these Jews who definitely have something very big to gain in lying have been a major source of the information that the general public has gotten regarding the Holocaust. So our epistemology, where our information comes from, and the nature of that knowledge and information, of course, is very important. So we have to apply that to what we call the Bible, and how we are deriving knowledge and understanding from the Bible. Okay, so at this point in time, let me just do the short answer followed by the long answer, because they're both answers, Unfortunately, the short answer isn't really that much easier or uncomplicated than the long answer. The short answer regards, does the Bible teach what Jim asked, what Diane purported to answer? Okay, does the Bible teach we shouldn't eat meat? No. Does the Bible teach that eating vegetables is better for you than meat? No. Does the Bible teach that we should only eat certain kinds of meat? Some people say it does. And of course, they're going specifically off the Bible as it's currently translated, the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy chapter 14. Does the Bible teach that once upon a time, man ate nothing but vegetables or not meat? And then, after the flood, man was told to now don't eat vegetables anymore, but eat meat. On its surface, it would appear to, but the problem is there are contradictions in the text itself if we want to believe that that's actually what's being said. Furthermore, does the Bible teach that we can't have blood with the meat, or we can't consume blood? Well, if it does, and I know what passages would appear to say that, if it does, we do have a serious problem. Everybody out there who likes their steak rare has got an issue, because that redness and that red quote-unquote juice coming out of that rare steak is blood. There's blood all through all meat that you get. There are people, and some would say, well, that's why you have to cook it, because that the blood, and I guess somehow if we cook blood, that turns it into something else. I would think if we cook blood, it turns it into cooked blood. Now we have blood at 145 to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't not have blood. There's blood in every meat that we eat, and it's clearly in the meat. It might not be in big quantities, but unless someone presumes to actually quantify how much blood within the meat is acceptable, then we still have a problem. We still have issues that we get to argue over endlessly. And nothing's getting resolved in all of these endless arguments. So there appears to be, and this is what's important, using terms like there appears to be. It seems that the Bible says this. It appears that it says that. In our English translations it says this. The Koine Greek appears to say that. The Masoretic, and it should be called, don't call it just Hebrew, it's Masoretic Hebrew. All of our Bible information that we have, that we've gotten, it's all Masoretic Hebrew. It's not a pure language that has been unadulterated. It's all entirely adulterated. There is no one out there that teaches on the Bible and pulls from the Old Testament, and they have to. They have to. It doesn't matter if they're a New Testament teacher or not. If they teach only from the New Testament, if they're a John MacArthur, all of their teachings have to be, they have to be by definition, hinged on all of the material in the Old Testament, which, by the way, is like 75%, probably more than that, really, pushing 80% of all material is in the Old Testament. And then you've got your smaller percentage here in the New Testament. And what is it in the New Testament? It's four Gospels that contradict one another in nearly endless ways. 3 synoptics and 1 not synoptic, John. You have a lot of speculation on other possible gospel texts too, which are even more contradicting than those 4 that are in the canon, that some mystery men who none of us know, none of us were friends with, none of us were there, decided that these books harmonized, they were God-breathed and should be part of one singular cohesive work called the Bible. 4 Gospels, the book of Acts, which covers a very small amount of ground as far as time, place, and happenings, and then extensive amounts of letters, purportedly written by various authors, those letters even contradicting one another. So, now I know that Diane believes that she resolved this argument by quoting Paul. But Paul is rife with problems. The first problem, just on its surface, before we get into the harmony between, lack thereof, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is a serious lack of harmony between not only Paul and, for instance, James. There's a serious lack of harmony between Paul and the Gospels, or at least the Jesus of some of the Gospels. There's a guy who has a website, Jesus Words Only, who completely rejects the writings of the Apostle Paul for good reason. He has an entire website, and he's written books on the problems with accepting the Apostle Paul with the same authority as Jesus. Some of those problems are really simple just on their surface. Remember, God that you know of, because I wasn't there, you weren't there. We don't know that the one true God ever authenticated the ministry of this writer, these books, because we don't know he existed. We weren't there. The sources that would affirm that he existed are so minute and sparse, I don't even know if any source actually can truly attest to the existence of a man who is purported to have written most of the New Testament, by the way. His letters constitute the bulk of, the majority of the New Testament. And we have issues with Paul. Okay? We have issues like, for instance, where do we find his authentication in the New Testament? Book of Acts. Book of Acts. Who was written by who? Tradition tells us the book of Acts was written by Luke. Who was Paul's good pal? Luke. One might say that we have an issue as far as objectivity in the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Furthermore, we know that Jesus gave authority, right? According to the text, I personally have no knowledge that Jesus ever existed. And in fact, that's not a crazy claim. That's not far out there. There are many sources that can demonstrate to you the problems with this Jesus character ever even existing, based on all the available literature there is, which, by the way, is all establishment-approved literature. So if you want to prove otherwise, I don't know what literature you're going to, rather than your faith that the New Testament is authentic and establishment-approved literature, establishment-approved historical sources. And if you have a problem with history in the way that it's been written in the last 100 years, i.e., the Holocaust and World War II revisionism, you can't possibly be comfortable with the rest of the body of history. Because if a certain group of people had the power to change everybody's perception of all the events occurring in World War I and World War II, in such a short time as we've seen, then we can't logically say they would have nothing to do with, or wouldn't seek to, or be successful in changing the entirety of the record. So if you want to say, well, the reason there's so, establishment sources don't validate the existence of Jesus, then all you're left with is the documents contained in the New Testament, a gathering of books that don't harmonize in theme or language or terminology with the Old Testament. So we have the Apostle Paul introduced and made into an authority in the book of Acts written by his buddy Luke, when we know that, according to the text, Jesus gave authority to his personal disciples that witnessed him, witnessed his acts and his deeds, and then after the death of Judas and the supposed resurrection of Jesus, these disciples got together and they decided they needed to add one more to their number to replace Judas, and they needed to add someone who physically witnessed the deeds, the acts, the life of, and the ministry of Jesus, so they elected Matthias. They had the authority to do so. So we have to believe that, first off, maybe they didn't have the authority to do so, even though Jesus gave them authority. We can clearly see in the first couple of chapters of Acts that would appear that at least Peter and John had a great deal of authority, and it was Peter who implemented the vote to vote in Matthias. So we would have to believe that maybe they acted presumptuously, and that Jesus went behind their back many chapters later and appointed Paul as an apostle, as a core apostle, and not just a core apostle, but a guy who would end up writing the bulk majority of the New Testament? That doesn't sound strange at all. It doesn't sound strange that the accounts that are given between the book of Acts and his letters regarding his experience on the road to, where is it, Damascus? It doesn't strike you as odd that those accounts actually disagree. The details of them disagree one with another. So you've got a serious problem if you're resolving any issues in the Bible, especially issues from the Old Testament, with the writings of Paul. You'd have stronger ground to stand on if you were actually using the Gospels and the words of Jesus. Because the Jesus painted in the Gospels, even if we put them all together and we forget about all the contradictions in the Gospels, the Jesus painted to us in those is far different than the Jesus painted by this purported character, Paul. So you're standing on extremely shaky ground if you're going to use Paul as a resolution to all of these issues. So let's get into the problems that we got now, and where the atheists or the Bible critics, where they really stand strong on is the fact that all the Christians out there, and I mean, it stands to reason, it makes all kinds of sense in the world because they're Christians, but the overwhelming majority of people out there who would affirm the veracity and the divinity of the Bible are dead set on keeping the New Testament as part of actual inspired scripture. And whether we want to argue that any of it is inspired or not, and how much the divine being had to do with writing any portions of it or not, what I would argue is this. If it's all written in a way that is accurate and true, if any document is written in a way that is accurate and true, that doesn't try to skew events or change people's perceptions of things that happened, or the reality of the world and the things in it, and the possibility of God, an afterlife, lack of afterlife, you name it, put it all together. If anyone writes down any document that is absolutely true and accurate to all things that they are writing down, I would call that godly. I would call that holy, since it would appear that the word holy actually comes from being whole, complete, truthful, healthy. So, What are the problems between the New Testament and the Old Testament? Well, there's a lot. And this gets to our epistemology. You can't not listen to this part of it if you want to try to understand any part of the Bible. You don't get to ignore this part of it, where we talk about the serious fundamental problems between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's part of our epistemology. We have to address it. So what are our themes and therefore our problems between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Well, let's naturally start in the Old Testament. What are the themes? Well, we have a couple of small, brief chapters, absolutely rife with dubious terminology. That's where we go back to the Masorah and the problems with the Masorah, because the Masorah, all those dots and dashes that are on top of words, those are called nikudot, which is supposed to be a feminine plural for nikud. Nikud is supposed to come from the Hebrew word nakad, meaning to pierce or to mark. They aid in dividing up words into parts of speech, for one thing, and into different words than what they seem to be on their surface. This is the tool that's used in order to make two words that are absolutely the same word in every way, shape, or form into two remarkably, profoundly different things. Because translations are made based on the parts of speech as well as the notes, which are part of the Masorah. You have the Nakud, you have the notes, you have demands like Kir and Katib, what you should see but not read, and what isn't seen but should be read. These things, they're not just Jewish, because of course the Jews pay very little to no attention to the Bible. They are Talmudic, and the Talmud is a whole different thing, as well as the Zohar, and the what's that other one? The book of mysticism, of course, the Kabbalah. It's completely different, of course, completely, totally different. They are books, I would say, like the Apocrypha and the New Testament, which use the Old Testament as a way of providing a certain air of authority for those other books and those other documents and teachings. So you have this really small amount of the Old Testament, basically chapter 3 and 4, which seem to describe a situation happening in Eden wherein man fell from grace. Mostly 3, because 4 is sort of a chronicle or a little situation between Cain and Abel, right? The first two sons that Adam and Eve were supposed to have had, right? The problem is when we pick up in chapter, now there's no themes in Genesis 1 and 2 that would confirm or agree with Genesis 3 and 4, those two chapters. Neither is there from Genesis 5 all the way forward to the last word in the book of Malachi. So if our fundamental problem, man's fundamental problem that the entirety of the New Testament hinges upon, is all to be found just in Genesis chapter 3, mostly, not even 4, 3, a few verses from 3, because the rest of it's kind of, it's a description of the so-called serpent, this Nakash, and Eve, and did God say don't eat that, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. If that really was man's fundamental problem, and I am talking about themes in the Old Testament, we have to address that. This very small portion of the book of Genesis. If man's fundamental dilemma really was the fall as articulated from very poor translations in Genesis 3, one would expect not only to see that situation and man's situation because of that situation, the actions that happened with the serpent and Eve and Adam and all that, one would expect those things to not only be talked about from Genesis chapter 5 all the way to the end of the book of Malachi. For those who are not familiar, Malachi is the book that's placed at the end of the Old Testament. It's not necessarily the latest dated book, and I've actually argued that it's a very early dated book, the book of Malachi, but it's placed at the end of what we call the Old Testament. There's not even mention of Adam and Eve and the fall from Genesis chapter 5 all the way through the whole body of the Old Testament. We only see Adam even mentioned again in the book of Chronicles in a chronology that essentially repeats the chronology that we see beginning at Genesis chapter 5. We see nothing regarding that event of man's fall, his depravity. These are themes that the New Testament makes absolutely flourish. It's the central themes of the New Testament. These are the central themes of the Calvinists, who base, of course, all of their beliefs off or all of their teachings. I don't know if Calvinists all believe what they teach, to be honest with you. All their teaching to us, based on this small incident, one chapter in the book of Genesis, which seems to be essentially a chapter that exists informationally, apart from what happens before it and everything that occurs after it. We have nothing. We have nothing in the law, all of the law. So we could say that begins at Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham is called. We have nothing in Genesis chapters 10 and 11, right? Post-flood, the genealogies post-flood, nor of 8 and 9, which is supposed to be immediate post-flood, and some directions and things that seem to have happened, so on and so forth. We don't have anything in there. But let's start at Genesis chapter 12, the calling of Abraham, and the dispensing of these laws, these directions, this guidance, which finally culminates after they leave Mitzrayim, not Egypt, Mitzrayim. It all culminates in an agreement made between this nation that was planted in Abraham, blossomed through Isaac and Jacob's 12 sons, grew to great proportions in Mitzrayim over 200 years, not 400 years. They were not in Mitzrayim 400 years, over 200 years. They blossomed into a huge people who had a lot of other people that weren't Israelites that came out of Mitzrayim with them. This all happened at a place called Sinai. There was an agreement that Israel would act in certain ways. That is typically called Torah. It's from Turei in the Oberi. And that they would be able to occupy this great deal of land, which started with all of the holdings of these various nations living in a land called Canaan, because it was occupied mostly by these nations of Canaan. The agreement says that if they kept all of the particulars that Yahweh gives to Moses, mostly in the area of Sinai, that they would be able to not only keep all of this inheritance regarded as the land of Canaan, but many other texts throughout the law says that they would also expand and get even more land, more holdings, more blessings, more good things, all contingent upon the law. And we have, of course, blessings and cursings that are all entirely contingent on the law, it would appear. from Deuteronomy chapter 32. This is the theme of the Old Testament. Now, regarding things like, oh, but there's the priesthood, there's the Levitical priesthood, there's the Kohen or Kohanim, they're Ken, probably very similar to the old Gaelic Ken, which is like sight, how far you could see, things like that, knowledge, wisdom, Ken. What about all of them, and what about these Levitical feasts and what they pointed to in the far distant future? So surely they pointed to Jesus, as did the sacrifices, like the sacrifice at Passover, and all of these details. So, certainly they all pointed to Jesus and the culmination of all the law, because, and I'm not going to play this part, but it's in there, so I watched the whole video. One thing that Jim and Diane go on about for some time is how man can't keep the law. It's impossible for man to have kept the law, and that's why we needed the New Testament and Jesus. But that is in contradiction to what we can find in the Old Testament. In fact, Yahweh, not Jehovah, Yahweh says clearly regarding the law and Israel's ability to keep it. Because what kind of a good, decent sovereign sets up this nation to fail? Not only sets them up to fail with a law they can't keep, but punishes them repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, which is supposed to cover, 4,000 years? Israel was supposed to be a nation for over 1,000 years before the start of the New Testament. What kind of a good God sets them up in an agreement, so it's a contract? He offered them terms of a contract, and they took the contract. What kind of a good, supreme being sets them up to fail? I don't know what kind of mental gymnastics we have to go through to justify him setting them up to fail. But of course, we see the same thing in the New Testament, just repeated. He didn't set them up to fail. And I'm going to show you why and how and what he says, which proves he didn't set them up to fail. Now, I could start in Deuteronomy 29, but I don't think it's necessary. All the way through the book of Deuteronomy, we have a retelling and reinforcing of the law, a number of sets of agreements of behaviors, of moral behaviors, governmental behaviors, equal weights and balances, not forming monopolies, things like this, behaviors, that if you do them and you keep all of these statutes that I've given you, you'll be blessed, and Israel would be an example for good to the world. But if they wouldn't, Israel would be an example for bad. Not because they became the Jews and everybody can see how bad the Jews are. No, Israel would be an example to the world of what happens to a lawless nation. And many other bad things happen, by the way, to lawless nations around Israel that the prophets addressed. Many of the prophets spent much of their books actually addressing other nations and other peoples. Why? The answer would have to be based on everything we see within all of the rhetoric of the prophets talking to other nations, because they were lawless also. But let's go to Deuteronomy 30. So after all of this law has been redispensed and repeated, we have, let's start at, look, I would say read the whole of the chapter, and the chapter before it, and up to 2 or 3 chapters after it. But let's just start Deuteronomy 30 and verse 9. And the Lord thy God will make thee plenteous in every work of thine hand, in the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy land, for good. For the Lord will again rejoice over thee for good, as he rejoiced over thy fathers. If thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law, and if thou turn unto the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Here we got if what? Keeping the commandments, keeping the agreements which are contained in commandments given. If you'll do all of those things, I'll greatly bless you. This is exactly what he says and what he repeats in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Then he goes on and he says, for this commandment which I command thee this day is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. It's not in heaven, that you should say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near unto you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. See, I have set before you this day life and good, and death and evil. In that I command you this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord thy God shall bless thee in this land wherever you go to possess it. And there's a little portion of what I meant about they were given Canaan in the first place. And they were meant to expand as they were blessed. Their families would increase. The amount of property they had would increase. This is how nations expand. But they were given in the first place a very, very large and rich nation. Not a tiny little nation called Palestine in the Middle East. They were given a broad, good land full of springs, of waters and natural resources and vast farmland, pasture and garden and field land where they could grow wheat and corn. That's not the Middle East. I won't go off on a tangent on that, but that's not the Middle East. It doesn't match, desertification or not, which is a fanciful theory without hard proof. However, back to the theme. So we're saying a good and righteous God just made this agreement with them so that they would fail, even though he just said here, this is doable. Do these things and you'll have all of this. He didn't mention in all of his dispensation of the law the problems that man was experiencing as per one chapter in the book of Genesis, which seems a little bit to not even agree with the chapter before or after it. He didn't mention any of that. He didn't mention man's fundamental problem in that they'd fallen. He mentioned an agreement that was started with Abraham, culminated in Israel at Sinai, and one that he held Israel to for the entirety of their history, all the way to where the trail runs cold, which is pretty much Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Haggai, maybe Joel. That's kind of where we see about the trail run cold. And of course, from that point, we have what? We have establishment secular sources telling us, like Josephus, he's not a Christian, and Josephus's writings don't agree with the New Testament. We have them telling us about the kingdom of Greece. We have establishment sources telling us about Rome. And we appear to have the New Testament telling us about Rome. So the themes that we see in the Old Testament is agreements with man centered on a nation as an example. That nation is not the only people. And we can see this in even the way that the Old Testament is currently translated. We can see that this nation are not the only people, not the only kind of people that Yahweh cares about or communicates with, has dealings with. But these are people that have an agreement with him which regards blessing a good life for one. Now, I don't know anything about an afterlife or anything like that, because I don't see that in the way the text is written in the Old Testament. Okay? But we do have that. We have an agreement that regards a good land, and even more, if Israel would have kept the law, which they tended to not do, and it was not undoable, because if Yahweh made an agreement with Israel that was undoable, that would have been an unrighteous thing to do. I know people say, well, you don't understand. The law reflected his character, and man couldn't possibly measure up to his character. I mean, so there's the problem. Well, no, the law doesn't entirely reflect his character, because he doesn't have wives. He doesn't have multiple wives, but he allows man to have wives and multiple wives. We're not talking about a direct reflection of his character. We are talking about agreements that would appear to be the best way for man to comport himself personally and societally, that could have, and sometimes did, in Israel's history, as per what we can understand in the Old Testament, sometimes worked out really great for them when they even, kind of kept the law. But most of the time, it really wasn't keeping the law all that well. It was mostly them seeing how badly they had messed up and crying out to him somewhat corporately, and him providing deliverers. I mean, not just through the book of Judges, but through Kings. And eventually, just things got worse and worse and worse and worse. So instead of Israel being blessed in all possible ways and expanding as they were supposed to, because I would imagine if they kept the law and stayed blessed, they would expand and expand and expand and expand, and who knows how much that expansion would have covered. But instead of seeing that, what we see is them having basically nothing but problems, and them shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And in fact, we even see in the law that Yahweh says that they were going to screw up if they didn't keep the law. Now, he didn't just say, you're going to screw up and this is what's going to happen, but he did definitely seem to, based on the translations we have, allude to the fact that they were going to wind up, spread over the whole world, if they didn't do what he told them to do. But that doesn't mean that he set them up to fail. He clearly told them they can do this. He made an agreement with them based on those parameters. And if they could not do it, he was the unrighteous party in an agreement. That's what we have to conclude. Those are essentially the themes of the Old Testament. Now, we could get into themes that are a little bit more detailed, like as far as, well, what exactly is Hosea saying regarding the 10 tribes, the house of Israel, and redemption. We could get into those. What about Judah or the rest of the people that were left when the trail runs cold at Ezra, Nehemiah, a little bit after them, Zechariah, Haggai? Would they have a redemption? Now, there seems to be passages, not only in Hosea, but also in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and maybe Isaiah, which seem to indicate that they would be eventually redeemed, that he would not put grace and love in their heart, but the law in their heart. He would plant it in their heart basically like in their DNA. The law. He says, the law. And that's how they would be redeemed. He says, I'm Israel's Redeemer. I'm Israel's Savior. There's no other. It's me. Which I'm sure is what led to having to develop ideas like the Trinity. Because the Old Testament and the New Testament don't agree in themes. Now, I just went over what's the main theme that the New Testament works off of. It works off of one chapter a theme of an event and supposedly a judgment in one chapter of Genesis, which is not repeated in the entirety of the Old Testament. That is the entire body of the New Testament. It doesn't agree in theme. If it agreed in theme, it would pick up with the same themes of the Old Testament. I'm sorry, if you like the themes better of the New Testament, you have a problem, because they're not the same themes as the Old Testament. You say, what about all those feasts and the priesthood and the kings and how they seem to culminate in Jesus and all this? First off, we don't have any proof in the Old Testament that those themes were meant to point to a Messiah. I've been through this whole idea of this word Mashiach and whether or not they seem to point to this Jesus or not, and they don't seem to. There's all kinds of different people referred to as Mashiach, and it's also used as an adjective for other peoples and other events. For all we know, those feasts were simply, could have been meant as a perpetual system of, I don't want to say welfare, but in part to support the Levites, because they weren't meant to be paupers. They also weren't meant to be the rulers per se, but they weren't meant to be paupers. They would come up a few times a year. They would bring a number of things a few times a year. They would give a certain portion of certain things. That's always integral with these things. And then part of them, the reason, would be to remember. I can't even count how many times in the Old Testament it's reminded to Israel throughout over 1,000 years of history. Think about that. How many times it's reminded to Israel that their nation was birthed through a simple covenant with the patriarchs and then their deliverance from Mitzrayim. It's constantly reminded. Because I would imagine those events when they occurred, where they occurred, which is not in the Middle East and not in Egypt and not on the Sinai Peninsula, because they don't match up. Those were regarded at the time, until all of this was wiped, as far as where they happened and how amazing they were and what they really were. The extent of them was the birth of a nation. It was probably the greatest event that had ever happened in the history of man since man started. So as part of a covenant, if Yahweh says that you're going to keep certain feasts which are going to remind you of certain things, like for instance your deliverance from Mitzrayim, like for instance the fact that your fathers, the three patriarchs, were strangers in a strange land for 200 years, and then the 12 tribes and their descendants were strangers in a strange land for another 200 years, like the last feast of the year, which most people call tabernacles, and then their time in the wilderness. If he said you're going to keep that feast once a year, yeah, that makes all kinds of sense. We keep man's holidays, many of them, every calendar year, to celebrate things that I would say are bullshit. Not even nearly as important. So if you ask me, well, what did those feasts have to do with? They don't have to have had to have done with a Messiah, Jesus. You also have the fact that none of the prophecies that I've ever gone over and referenced in the Old Testament, where they're supposed to be pulled from, line up contextually with the New Testament. One of them actually being from what? From Genesis 3, of course. The problem with that prophecy is your seed and his seed. So we've got a seed of this Nakash. Well, is it Satan? Is that what this Nakash is? Is it a serpent? Is it a man? Because what we see in Genesis chapter 3, we see this prophecy of your seed and his seed and things that are going to happen to the two. Well, what's being referred to when anybody else refers to somebody's seed throughout the entirety of the Old Testament? Talking about their children. Your children. And his children. Right? So you have to read into it this idea of types and shadows to try to even line that up with New Testament themes. How about what? Isaiah 7? The prophecy that Isaiah gives to King Ahaz about a child that would be born and his name would be Emmanuel. The context doesn't work because, first off, if you just read the surrounding chapters in Isaiah, you'll see that they were talking about the fact that Aram, not Syria, Aram, and the house of Israel had formed an alliance with one another and were getting ready to come down and invade Judah. So Isaiah goes to King Ahaz and he says, this isn't going to happen. Yahweh's not going to let this happen. And just so that you can stop worrying about it, pick a sign and he'll complete it so that you know. And then Ahaz, he acts like he's modest and humble, which he's not. And Isaiah says, okay, so look, if you're going to fake like you're humble, I'll give you a sign. Here's what's going to happen. The young woman, not the virgin, the Olameh, young woman, this young woman, he says, there's more to it, will conceive, she'll have a child, and before this child knows the good from the evil and all this, that Yahweh will have destroyed these nations who you think are going to come down and destroy you. And people really believe that Isaiah 7 is referring to some future Jesus, when it's clearly referring to events happening in the time of Ahaz and Isaiah, because Isaiah continues and he says, and I went into the prophecy, he had sex with the prophetess, she got pregnant. She had a child, and while that child was still an infant, Yahweh brought all those things to pass. There you have the fulfillment. And this whole thing about his name would be Emmanuel, it's Omnual. He's all Isaiah says is, it will be said that with nu, us, omnu, al, God. That God's with us. You'll know. It'll be said that God's with us. If his name was supposed to be Emmanuel and that prophecy was supposed to be referring to Jesus, why didn't they name Jesus Emmanuel? That's kind of strange, right? No, because the angel, I guess, gave Mary and Joseph information which made them think that Jesus was a better name. See, even things like that don't line up. Name him Emmanuel then. That at least would get you a little bit closer to Isaiah. None of them match up. And of course the theme. The theme from Genesis 12 forward is absolutely centered around Israel and this keeping of the law and the conduct of man. And I believe that man had enough communications and dealings with one another that everyone in the world understood that Israel was a place that had an agreement with the one true God. In fact, we see that throughout the text here, there, and wherever that is re-emphasized. That people knew this. Israel was an example to the whole world. That's the whole theme. And as I said, there are many passages just in the translations that we have today that would seem to indicate that not that Israel was poof, they'd gone, or poof, they had been replaced by everybody, but that Israel would be preserved, and it's entirely possible to preserve a people without mixing into them all kinds of seeds from all other kinds of people or races and ethnicities. Just look at our world today. Do the rich commingle with the poor? If Israel was cast out of their inherited land, we're just going to say the land of Canaan, if they were cast out of that, we know that they were cast out of that by being taken captive by successive nations and moved around to whatever territories those successive nations had control over, or they were bought and sold and traded as slaves to other nations who needed what? Slaves. And they lived and remained as slaves apart from, first off, the regular citizens of that country and the upper class of that country. Secondly, if you say, well, there were various people who probably lived around them wherever they were put, whether it was in the mines or whether it was out in the fields to grow the wheat or wherever it was, there would have been other people around them that they naturally, I'm sure, would have had children with, maybe sometimes. But we can just see, even in our own time, as hard as the machine works to get us to all blend together, we can see in our own time that if you have 12 ethnicities in a city within 12 blocks, those ethnicities stay to themselves. They keep their culture. They make damn sure their daughters aren't fucking around with other people of other cultures, races, or ethnicities. They stay insulated. This is a common feature of people no matter where they go. So of course it's entirely possible, no, not possible, it's entirely plausible that a huge amount of Israel stayed pure after they were ejected from the land, or the Israel that remained in the land of Canaan, wherever that may be, that they stayed pure because they stayed mostly to themselves, which by the time of the end, where the trail of the Old Testament runs cold, they would have all either been slaves, or if they had done well in other countries, like I'm sure they did very well in the territories that this Paris, that's the kingdom with Mede, that most people call Persia, because that's the way the translators make it sound, Persia, Paris. I'm sure mostly that a lot of the Israelites and Judahites, maybe especially Judahites, did really well in all the territories that Paris presided over. And maybe because they did so well, and they still kept their culture, and they were distinct, to where maybe even you could just look at them and tell that they weren't like the people that lived around there in these territories of Paris, that they became enough of a problem that, yeah, probably the nation and the subsequent nations decided that maybe they should have some wars. Maybe they should have some wars based on a lot of lies and clean these people out, especially Judah among the Gauls. Because they're called Gauls. That's the word used in the Bible. They're Gauls. And Judah would have been Gauls too, not just Israel. Because Gaul is just a word meaning the captivity, to be taken away. Gauls, Celts. Judah would have been the same thing, would have had similar language, they would have looked very similar. Of course, they all came from the same parentage. So yes, it's entirely plausible that they remained a distinct people, even when a lot of them were wiped out in those territories not that long ago. So anyways, the New Testament is written in an entirely different language than the Old Testament, by the way. The New Testament is written in something called Koine Greek. Koine Greek is not only a different language in syntax, in grammar, in terminology, in alphabet, but Koine Greek does not have equivalent terms with Hebrew. We have to read into a lot of the terms that are used in Koine Greek to say that they are Hebrew terms, or we have to try to reference the Septuagint, which doesn't always translate the Hebrew terminology from the Old Testament the same as what we find in the New Testament. It's a shit show. And most of the terms that would seem to be in line with Old Testament terms are clearly transliterated into this Koine Greek. So here's the problem. If Yahweh, or God, if he wanted to preserve his word and tell the whole world about his son and the salvation from man's fundamental problem being the fall of man, which apparently happened in one chapter in Genesis and then is never repeated in the Old Testament. If you wanted to tell the whole world about that and bring salvation and goodness to everyone, wouldn't it make just all the sense in the world to write all of that material in the language that he kept intact and wrote almost 80% of the scriptures in consistently over more than 1,000 years of time, but then he all of a sudden switches it up and they write in Greek, which is additionally weird since Israel, we're just going to say what? Judea, if we want to go by establishment facts and figures and logic, Judea. Judea was supposed to be presided over, ruled over by the Romans. And what language do they tell us that Rome spoke? Latin. They didn't speak Greek. They spoke Latin. But we're supposed to believe that the lingua franca, the language that Rome allowed to be spoke throughout their empire, making them look like a bunch of nutless pussies, was Greek. Not Latin. We're just going to let the people talk in the Greek. We're going to make the Greek the language. Even though Latin's our language, we'll let them speak Greek. So that's kind of a problem of logic, too. And that doesn't even begin to start addressing the problems in, for instance, end-time prophecies that we find not only in like Matthew 28 and Luke, but heavily throughout Paul, and then just in the worst way imaginable in the book of Revelation. A tapestry of confusion which may not have a parallel, the book of Revelation. Basically cherry-picking little bits and pieces of cool-sounding information as per the way it's currently translated, cool-sounding information from the Old Testament, and just kind of throwing it all together with a bunch of new stuff about trumpets and scrolls and crazy shit happening with prophets and fire raining down, shit nobody's ever seen. But it's okay that nobody's ever seen it. It either happened entirely in the New Testament, or it's gonna happen one day, and who knows when that is, or it happened symbolically throughout the last 2,000 years since the birth and life and death of Jesus, and that's called historicism, or it's just ideas, man. It's just ideas, man. That's the fourth one, idealism or spiritualism of Revelation. Either way, it's an insane shit show that absolutely does not make any sense whatsoever of the Old Testament and the prophets. In fact, it makes less sense of it, because if you go into the prophets and you try to figure out what the prophets were actually saying and what its implications were, and you've got Revelation stuck in your head, or you've got prophecies of Paul stuck in your head, or you've got Matthew 28 stuck in your head, you're going to be even more confused than if you just tried to sit down with that text alone. Let's say the book of Zechariah. That's one of the kind of tougher ones because of some of the things he covers, which I think have actually been covered up so badly, like translated so badly, because he was one of the last prophets that actually wrote that ended up being carried over into our present day. But you try to go back to that, you're going to sort that out, and you've got all of this junk in your head from the New Testament. There's the problem. We're trying to view all the information given to us in the Old Testament through New Testament glasses. And we're not using any objectivity to do that with. We're using our own wants. We want the gospel to be true. We want redemption and salvation as articulated in the Gospels and New Testament. We want that to be true. we want to have grace, we want to have heaven forever, but we don't want to keep the law. We want all the goodies, and we don't want any of the bad things that come along with everything articulated regarding a lawful people and an unlawful people throughout the law and prophets called the Old Testament. And here's the thing, when you start going on about, well, it's so much better in the New Testament, these themes, they're just so much better because you don't have to worry about keeping all these laws that are impossible to keep, which aren't, we just saw. Unfortunately, we've got a problem with the way they've been translated because of what the Masorah. So that is a problem. It's something that we need to address so that we can understand what's being said, and then maybe we can do something about it. But if you say the New Testament's, but it's better because look, you have to worry about keeping all those laws and everything. All you got to worry about is loving your neighbor, being good to them. You don't want to hurt other people, and that's all you got to worry about is being good and loving. Well, let's go back to epistemology. How do you define what is good and loving apart from the precepts of the law? You don't get to say Paul or Jesus without the law. You do not. Okay? You do not get 1 Corinthians 13 without the law. The law is the standard regarding love, decency, kindness, goodness. You don't get to talk about those things without the law, because the law is your epistemology. And if you want to turn around and say, but you just said that we can't understand it because of the Masorah, okie doke, there you go. But if we can't understand the Old Testament because of the Masorah, we can't understand the New Testament, or we can't know for sure whether or not the New Testament is actually authentic and based on the Old Testament if we don't know what the Old Testament says. We better find out. And until then, I think it's only responsible to, first off, not think to teach other people these precepts and these prescriptions as an authority, but to simply say, it would appear this way, it would appear that way, and so on and so forth. And yes, the Bible is rife with problems, for the most part, based on everything that we can observe, because, for one thing, we've got at least 2 languages we're looking at being used, and that's not counting the Aramaic that we see in a few of the chapters of Daniel or the letters in Ezra and Nehemiah. That's not counting arguments where people say that the New Testament was written in Aramaic. That's just, as it stands, we have serious issues with the fact that we've got 2 languages which are remarkably different in the New Testament and the Old Testament. And even worse, we have a bona fide language added to the original language of the Old Testament, which changes fundamentally the way we perceive the text in terminology, in grammar, in syntax, even in theme. Because whoever applied chapter stops and verse stops to the Old Testament, or the New, yeah, let's just do the whole thing, fine. Whoever applied those can actually change what we believe any given chapter or any given verse is saying by putting a stop arbitrarily in a certain place. They do this same thing just by applying punctuation. No punctuation exists in quote-unquote Hebrew, Oberi, or Koine Greek. They apply it. Punctuation has a very strong effect on what the text is saying. And here's the deal. Anybody who wants to ignore this and wants to keep acting like a Bible teacher and basing everything they're teaching on like, thus saith the Lord, they're doing that for one thing. On an entire Old Testament, which has all been tainted by the Masorah. And who is it that our historical sources tell us invented and implemented the Masorah? The Jews. Rabbinical, i.e. Talmudic, i.e. not friendly to Goyim or Christian, Jews. Now this is, of course, anybody who's just a straight Protestant who hears that, it's probably not going to have the same marked effect as those who run in Christian identity circles. But all those who run in those circles, that's exactly who contrived that whole system according to establishment history. If you don't like that, you don't like how that sounds, well, how are you going to figure that out? You'd better put some attention and some time into sorting out your epistemology. So, approaching an hour 30. I hope I've done some small part in articulating what really the real issues are when we start getting into what I see, as secondary and tertiary and even beyond biblical issues. I don't think it's worth our time or our effort to argue about these things. I don't think it's worth our time or effort to believe these things, which are based on erroneous epistemologies. We really need to go to the source and figure out what's the makeup of, what's the evidence of the authentic or divine nature of our sources, and how can we absolutely know that based on everything I've said here today, and I'm sure plenty of other information which I didn't have time for or missed. Before we spend all kinds of times on these arguments, because they're arguments because there's disagreement, and there's disagreement because there is not just question, but innumerable questions raised by the existence of the problems with how we have been presented the text. And I'll leave it with that. This is not on an attack on anyone in particular, but I just used that small clip from that video of Jim and Diane as a jumping off point. Jim and Diane aren't saying anything that's different to what anybody else says, more or less. It's not any different than a lot of things that I've said over the years or believed over the years. I'm simply addressing what I believe is the fundamental problem that too few of us, if almost none of us, seem to be addressing. So with that said, I am going to wrap this one up, and I will see everybody next time.